One of the fundamental concepts that I want to illustrate and use in my teaching of Old Testament theology is the notion of foundational words, foundational events. We come in Genesis 12 to 50 to some of the most important founding stories, foundational events. In traditional society, the question you ask always is, who is the father or mother of something? If you want to get the thinking, who is the father of wisdom in the Old Testament? Who is the father of psalmody in the Old Testament? Who is the father of kingship? No, that's ambiguous. You could say Saul, but he's the father of wrong kind of kingship. Who's the father of the right kind of kingship? David. But who is the father of Israel? Who is the mother of Israel? That's what we mean by the term patriarch. By the way, patriarchal has now been given a bad odour because of feminist theology and feminist ideology, which sees only evil in it and looks at it with postmodern or modernist point of view. I don't want to analyse that, but you see what's at stake here is the question of origins and foundations. God's dealing with the patriarchs is not just the beginning of his dealings with Israel, but provides the ongoing basis for God's subsequent dealing with Israel. So what God speaks to Abraham, he doesn't just speak to Abraham, he speaks to all his descendants. What God does to Abraham, he does to all his descendants. And so it's foundational. It's not just foundational historically in terms of where did it all start, but in terms of God's ongoing activity and God's ongoing commitment. Well, God's dealings with the patriarchs, there's two things that I want to focus on, first of all. First of all, most generally, what's the function of God's revelation, God's speaking is probably a better word, to the patriarchs. Let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 7, 6 to 8, where you get that summed up very, very nicely and neatly. Deuteronomy chapter 7, 6 to 8.
For you are a people holy to the Lord your God.
Now, why are you a holy people to God? That's the foundation. Okay? Israel is God's holy people. Therefore, how come?
The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the peoples on the face of the earth to be his people, his treasured possession. The Lord did not set his affection on you and choose you because you were more numerous than other peoples, for you were the fewest of all peoples. But it was because the Lord loved you and kept the oath he swore to your forefathers that he brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the land of slavery, from the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt.
Why is it that Israel is a holy nation? What makes Israel different? There's nothing in themselves that makes them different. They're no better, no more numerous, no more virtuous than any other nation. What makes the difference is God's love. And then God's choice and God's rescue of them. And ultimately God's covenant with them, which you'll find then in the next verse. Can you read verse 9?
Know therefore that the Lord your God is God. He is the faithful God, keeping his covenant of love to 1,000 generations with those who love him and keep his commands.
So in Genesis 12 to 50, you get the foundational events for Israel's existence as a holy people, the people of God. You get God intervening in history, human history. Now, there's something surprising about this, because all other nations, pagan nations, with their religions, trace their origin back to the beginning. So, at the beginning time, and if this is a pagan story, the founder of Israel would be Adam, which doesn't make much sense, because you'd have to have other people who found other nations. But you see the way it goes? So the Egyptians found their foundation at the beginning. At least this is religions in the Middle East. Israel is different, because its foundation is not the beginning of history, but God's intervention in human history after the fall, after the flood. Secondly, God doesn't just intervene, but he intervenes to disclose his presence and his purpose for Abraham and his descendants. By his intervention, which is verbal, he creates Israel as his people. So Israel doesn't create itself, God creates it by intervening, by speaking in human history. And the way God intervenes, what God does there with Abraham, sets a precedent for what God will do subsequently in the history of Israel. So whenever you read those stories in Genesis, ask the question, in what does what God is doing here set a precedent for what he will subsequently do? So take, for example, the story of God's appearance to Jacob at Bethel, where the angels come down, and God makes a wonderful series of promises to Jacob. What does this set a precedent for? When the Israelites enter the land? Can you work it out?
It's a place of worship.
It's a place of worship, but and worship in what sense? Worship's a waffle word. A place where God's going to do what? God is going to come down the ladder in order to bless them. He's going to come down the ladder to bless them. This will be a gate to heaven, not just for Jacob, but to every Israelite who comes there. And you'll find then later on that Jacob promises to give a tithe of all his possessions to God if God brings him back from the land he's going to, from the land of Haran. If he brings them back, he'll give a tithe, and you'll find that in Genesis 35, Jacob does that. He builds an altar and presents a tithe of all the offerings he brings, and then God appears to him once again. You have two great appearances of God to Jacob at Bethel. Just as God met with Jacob, he meets with the Israelites. Just as Jacob presented a tithe to God there, can you work out? Therefore the Israelites did what? They brought their tithes to God at the gate of heaven. Hence it is the house of God. Bethel, house of God, gate of heaven. Right? So God's dealings there set the precedent for his subsequent dealings with his people. Now, what's most astonishing, maybe not from us because we're so used to it, but if you came to this cold as a Hindu or as a Buddhist, particularly as a Hindu, what would strike you is the manner of God's revelation. In each case you have a theophany, but the emphasis is not on them seeing God. Occasionally the term is used, God appeared to Abraham. Now, Ra'ah is to see, Nirah is the nifal. God made himself visible or seeable. God appeared. You'll get that nifal used several times, but in each case the appearance is not visual, but the appearance is verbal. At the most, the appearance is as an angel in disguise. Now, so the theophany, and here I go back to something I did earlier on, the theophany is not a visual theophany, but a verbal theophany. How does God appear? He appears by speaking to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. Sometimes he appears as an angel disguised as a human being, and he speaks. Sometimes he speaks to one of the patriarchs in a dream, but always the focus is not on what is seen, but on what is said, the word. So you have the theophanic word, God appearing by speaking his name, I am the Lord, or I am God Almighty, and then you have the words that are given, commands and promises, which are foundational commands and promises. Now the content of these speeches, these theophanic speeches in Genesis, and I've tabulated them all for you if you want to look them through in your notes. There's a big table there. What page is it, Liz? You've got it open in front?
24.
Page 24, you get a tabulation of them. Basically, they consist of two things. First of all, God introducing himself by name. I am Yahweh. I am El. Remember, El's the name for the Canaanite high god, the creator. Or I am El Shaddai, God Almighty. Or quite commonly, I am the God of your father Abraham. I'm the God of your father Abraham, Isaac, your fathers. Right? So God introduces himself by name. He names himself. That's the theophany. And then he gives to one of the patriarchs his foundational commands and promises. Not just promises, but also commands. We'll see how important those commands are in a minute. Fourthly, what's significant about these theophanies, these appearances, is that they all occur in Canaan. God appears to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob in Canaan, apart from two very significant ones, the initial appearance to Abraham in Haran, and then God's appearance to Jacob when he was in Haran, who's a second Abraham. So apart from those two appearances, theophanies, all the theophanies occur in the Promised Land. And there's a very interesting feature, because almost all the theophanies conclude with either Abraham or Isaac or Jacob building altars at the site where God appeared. Sometimes God tells them to build altars. Others, there's just mentioned, and Abraham built an altar there and called on the name of the Lord. Or Abraham built an altar there. Now, what's the significance of the building of the altar? The next come here. You need to see that according to pagan theology, the jurisdiction of gods was local. So you had a temple of Baal. Now Baal, by the way, means owner, landowner. Baal didn't just own that temple, his house, but he owned the land around the temple. And he owned the people who lived on that land. And the people who lived on that land were therefore bound to do what? Serve Baal. They were the slaves of Baal at his temple. So everywhere in Canaan you had temples and you had gods and goddesses, and sometimes their jurisdictions overlapped. And then you get problems. Well, what happens then if you happen to live in this place? Your life gets a bit complicated.
We either serve both or
Well, you don't have the option of serving either. You've got to serve both equally, and that can be very expensive. You are a slave of both. Let's say, for example, you have Asherah, the earth mother, here, and you've got Baal here. You've got to pay your dues to both. So the gods own the land. Now, what does God do when he appears and he tells the patriarchs to build the altars on those places? What's he doing? He's signifying, it's even stronger than, he's reclaiming the land for who? For himself. So God reclaims the land long before the Israelites enter the land and take possession of it. God claims the land or reclaims the land from the pagan gods and the pagan people. You need to see that until modern times there's no such thing as everything is theological. Now, land ownership is theological, politics is theological, everything is theological. Every piece of real estate on the earth belongs to one or other or all the gods, particular gods. So Babylon belonged to the great Babylonian god Marduk and so on. And if you know any of your Greek history, if you've done ancient history, you know each one of the Greek cities had their patron deity. Have you heard of that? So, for example, Athens belonged to Athena, and etc. So each one of the great Greek cities, Ephesus belonged to the goddess Diana. I'm just picking up stuff that you know from the New Testament. Okay? That city belonged to that god, and the whole city was built around the temple of Athena, or the temple of Diana of Ephesus, the Earth Mother again. Now, secondly, those altars then were the sites of subsequent sanctuaries. The places where the patriarchs build the altar is the place where, when the Israelites came into the land, they created a sanctuary, they rebuilt the altars, and they became places of worship for the Israelites. And you just take notice of the various places in Genesis, and then you read the subsequent history of Israel, and you find each one of those is a holy place later on in history. There's one mysterious holy place that is not named. All of them are named, but there's one place, one mountain, which is called the Mountain of God, which is unnamed, and where Abraham builds a very significant altar. Do you remember what that place is? Sacrifice. The place where he sacrificed who? He was going to sacrifice Isaac. And God provides a male ram instead. You have the enigmatic statement then, on the mountain of the Lord, there's a nice ambiguity, he will provide or he will be seen. Abraham building that altar. But in that case, the altar was built before God's appearance. Usually the altar is built after the appearance. Now, that site is not named. You've got to go all the way to Chronicles before you find out the identity of that site. Do you know what that site is? That altar? Mount Moriah, yeah, and that means just, Moriah means seeing, the mountain of seeing, the mountain of vision. What's Mount Moriah? According to Chronicles, it is Jerusalem. But Jerusalem is one of the places that only is impinged on here, the altar, and indirectly. There's all sorts of problems connected with this, and as you can imagine, scholarly debates. So they are sites for future sanctuaries. Now, the way it works is this. If these appearances were pagan appearances, let's say God appeared to Abraham and God was Baal, what would Abraham have set up in the place where Baal appeared? Not an altar, but an idol. The face of God. Now, and what would be the point of the idol? Well, in the place where God appeared once to Abraham is the place where you can come and Baal will once again appear to Abraham and his descendants. Hence in Malaysia or in India, you get temples built on sites of Theophanies. Since, say, Krishna appeared to this person there, other people come to that place for Krishna to meet with Krishna, to present their offerings to Krishna, so that Krishna will appear to them too there in that place. So it sets a precedent for subsequent appearances. Abraham doesn't build idols, he builds altars as places of meeting with God. Sites of future sanctuary. And so each altar sets, and what God does in that place sets a precedent for what God will do for people who come to that place. So these are what scholars call, unkindly, etiological legends. Etiological means origin. The etiology is the origin of something, but more accurately described as the foundational stories of that particular sanctuary. Now, what do they answer the question? You say, why is it that we worship Yahweh here? Well, God appeared to Jacob here. And he didn't just appear to Jacob here, he appeared to Abraham here. Okay, he appeared to them. What's the story? And the story tells you not only what happened then, but what God is doing at this place and how God is meeting with his people in this place. But notice most importantly the function, the importance of altars. Altars as being most significant for the Israelites. Not holy places, not temples, not idols. Altars are significant. Any questions on that? Now, one of God's foundational promises, sets of promises to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, is God's promise of the land. Now that has ripples that last all the way through to the present time and lie at the root of much of the trouble in Israel at the present moment. Okay, how does it work? God's promise of the land. It begins, rather strangely, with God's command to Abraham to leave his land, his ancestral land, the land of his ancestors and their spirits, the land that belongs to him, for a land that God will show him and give to him. So he leaves his land for God's land. Okay, that's the promise. And that's right at the beginning you get that promise. Now what's paradoxical about that promise is that it's never fulfilled in the lifetime of Abraham or Isaac or Jacob or their descendants. And even when Joshua brought them to the land, it was only partially fulfilled. And yet it is the number one promise, one of the foundational promises that God gives to his people, the promise of the land. God gives the land of Canaan to Abraham. He promises Canaan to Abraham and his descendants. That's right there at the beginning. To you, your seed, I will give this land. And one of the first things that Abraham does when he comes to the land is that he walks over the land. Have you noticed that? Genesis 13, I think it is. He walks over the land. Now, for us, this is just a little insignificant detail, but it has great significance in the ancient world. To walk over the land means to claim that land, take possession of it. And once you've claimed it, then you walk over it to assert your property rights. So the way you claim the land, take possession of the land, is by walking over it. There were funny remnants of this back in the farming community that I grew up in. When we had visitors, say rallies, the women would be with mum and the girls in the kitchen, and what dad would do is take the men and they would do a walk around the homestead, at least, and if they had that time, they would drive around the paddocks. He would show them that there's something, there's a little bit of something here of remnant, a very ancient custom, where you claim this is your own, and you show people that this is your own, this is your land. You take possession of the land. And the idea is not basically ownership, but this is my responsibility.
In today's society,
yes.
You have people come over and you show them this is the kitchen, this is the lounge room, and then you walk out in the backyard.
That's right.
The dying orange tree over there.
Yep.
And that's where the dog ate that rat the other day.
My dad does it every visit. The border of the property. Shows them all the plants, shows them what he's done and what's going on.
Yeah, and shows them what he's done, his property, and how you see there is. It's not just ownership, but it's showing that you take care of it and what you've done with it. Now, yeah, this is very ancient, but like many ancient things, there's amazing survivals. No, anthropologists call these basically survivals. Ancient customs that live on long beyond their actual legal or practical function. Now, when your dad shows people around the place, it has no legal function. It has no ritual function. But in the ancient world, it had enormous ritual function. Now, it has a ritual function within the family, and you don't do this to everybody. Who do you show it to?
Well, to whoever comes around to the house.
Okay, your guest. And because what you're doing basically, when you have somebody as your guest in your house, you make them an honorary member of your family, and they, as it were, have a key to your house in some way, and you want to share not just the meal, but you want to share the house, the property with them. Right? Yeah, there's a lot of stuff, very interesting stuff here. And it's out of this then that you had a very interesting sets of customs in the ancient world. I hope you don't mind me doing this, but because there's lots of stuff in the Old Testament that don't make sense and are very immensely significant. You remember, maybe, or you may not remember, when Boaz, who became the husband of Ruth, bought land that belonged to Naomi and Ruth from his nearest kinsman. What they did was to swap shoes. So you took off the shoes and you gave the shoes. Your shoes, my shoes, are my land rights. And if I give my shoes to you, what am I doing? Giving you the title to the land, and then what would you do once you got that shoe? Was to walk over the land. So the prophet Amos condemns people who sell the poor for shoes or sandals. What's happening? They get people into such debt that they have to give them their shoes, which means give up their land, their property. The bank reclaims the land, the house. And the shoes are the legal transaction of this. Right, shoes. So in the ancient world, and this goes all the way even to the Roman Empire, you could tell whether a person was a landowner or a landless person by their feet. Landless people would go around barefoot. Landed people would wear shoes, sandals. And there's something very significant in the story of the prodigal son. What does the father do?
Gives him shoes.
Gives him shoes, which means gives him the land rights back again.
So this has been around in Jesus' day?
Well, the prodigal son shows it's still around then. Yeah. Yes, because you could tell straight away, whether somebody was shoed or not. They didn't exchange the land. By that time, you had law and you had land legal documents to indicate land rights. But this is a much more ancient property. But still, the connection between shoes and land ownership was very strong still in the time of Jesus. No, God doesn't just promise the land to Abraham, but he promises the land to Abraham as his descendants as a perpetual possession. Now, perpetual means until the end of time. For as long as history lasts, the land belongs to Abraham and his descendants. Can you see what the problem is theologically in the present moment? Who claims the whole of Israel, the land of Israel, as their possession? The Jews claim it for theological reasons. The Palestinians claim it for historical reasons. And the two don't fit together. Theology and history contradict each other. What's also significant, if you read Genesis very closely, is always to take notice not just of locality, Places are far more important for the Bible than modern theology allows. Okay? Places are very important, and places are very important for you too, and for the church. But what you need to take notice of is those stories where people either leave the land or come back to the land. Okay? Something significant's going on. Land is not neutral. So, for example, when Joseph is sent to the land of Egypt, the land of Egypt is not just another geographical location. The land of Egypt is the land that belongs not just to the sun god, but it belongs to Seth, the god of the underworld. For the Israelites, the land of Egypt, therefore, since Seth is the ruler, and since the water of the Nile comes from the underworld, Seth, it is the land of death. Land has significance, and it has theological significance. There's a difference between being in the land of Canaan and outside the land of Canaan. And in each place you need to weigh the significance of what's going on there. However, given all that, what's most startling, and here you get one of the amazing reversals that I'm going to be speaking about a lot, where God turns things on the head. God promises the land to Abraham. God brings Abraham to the land. But Abraham's status is that as long as he's alive, he remains a ger. Now, a ger is a landless alien, a resident alien. So a person who lives in the land but doesn't own any land. Okay, so a ger, which is quite often translated as sojourner or alien. Alien for us is a foreigner. It doesn't have that significance. But ger means a person who lives in the land but doesn't own any land. Ger. So he is a ger. He is a landless person in the land that God promised him. Now something funny is going on. God promised the land. The first thing that I would have expected God to do was to give Abraham the land. But it doesn't happen. The only piece of land that Abraham actually owned in his lifetime was his cemetery. The cemetery that he bought at Hebron, which is one of the flashpoints to the present day in Israel. The land at Hebron, which he bought from a Hittite group of people, and he bought it as his cemetery for himself and his descendants. Now, once again, we'd see this in secular terms as just a nice story, but this has very important both legal and theological significance. Now, how can I best explain it? I think I can explain it by what I saw in India. Now, what we do is to have cemeteries where people bury in one place. Now, the village cemetery. When you go through the Indian countryside, you will see graves in the middle of a paddock, in the middle of a rice field. All over the place. Graves. And this is in a country where most people are burnt, so in most cases it wouldn't be actual bones, but it's the ashes of a person put there, and you put the remains of a person, and it's marked by a grave. What's the significance of graves? Well, in tribal societies like this, graves have to do with land rights. Let's see if you can work it out. How can you say, this land belongs to me and my family? You don't have a piece of paper, you don't have a land registry. Because my family's buried there, and since my family's buried there, they're not just buried there, but their spirits are there. And the land therefore doesn't belong to me, it belongs to my ancestors and their spirits. And I receive the land from my ancestors and their spirits. And I take care of the land for whom? My ancestors. So ancestor reverence, graves, land rights all belong together. Now, God tells Abraham to buy this cemetery. Abraham buys this cemetery. And by buying this cemetery, what is Abraham in fact doing? Asserting the future claim on the land. And that's still lasting to the present day, because I don't know whether you know that some Jewish hotheads, very conservative Jews, have grabbed hold of the tomb of Abraham some years ago, and it's one of the flashpoints between Jews and Arabs to the present day. Why did they grab hold of the grave of Abraham and the synagogue that's over that place? It's a claim to what? The whole, which just Hebron? No, it's a claim to the whole promised land. It's asserting their land rights. So the cemetery at Hebron is the claim that Abraham has on future possessions. Now, why is it that God delays the gift of the land? You'll find it in Genesis chapter 15, Tom, where we have God's covenant with Abraham. Genesis 15, verse 15 and 16.
As for yourself, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete.
The iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. God is still patient with the people who live in the land. It's still not bad enough for him to intervene and to take the land away from them because they've abused the land which God had given them in the first place. The iniquity is not yet complete. So you get God's patience with the former owners. That means that the gift of the land is delayed. And I think if you take it more fully, there's another reason why the land is delayed. I would have expected the first gift that God to give to his people is land. But you get the following things. You get the covenant with Abraham, and the promise of the land, and the covenant of blessing comes first. And then you get Sinai covenant with the gift of the divine service. And then, land, Sinai, and then finally, after Sinai, they leave the mountain and go across the desert and enter the promised land. Now, normally speaking in paganism, what determines which God you worship and your relationship with the God?
Who owns the land?
Who owns the land? So you worship the local God. Okay, so land and theology go together. Worship of gods and land go together. But here you get something new in human history. God gives Israel the divine service, and the divine service is not attached to what? The land. They worship God even when they didn't have any land. Abraham, and then the divine service, they worship God fully. In that period of the desert, they didn't own any land. And likewise, when they were in exile, they still worship God even though they didn't have any land. For pagan people, this is nonsense. So, even though geography, land is very significant in the Old Testament, worship of God, the identity of Israel as a holy people is not dependent on the land. The land, if you like, is one of the gifts that comes after the divine service and after the covenant with Abraham. And there are a number of other very important gifts that are given in the land. One of the most important ones in the land is the gift of kingship. There's no kingship given here, no kingship given here, as I would expect if they're going to be politically and culturally and socially viable, they'd have a political system of kingship so that they stay together. That is subsequent here. So something is of very importance happening here. One of my most vivid experiences, it's not one, some of the most vivid times that I've had in teaching Old Testament is to our Aboriginal pastors and evangelists to Central Australia. And the first time I ever taught them was back in the time when there was a lot of agitation for Aboriginal land rights, them getting their land back. And I took them through the stories of Abraham. And they understood these stories far better than any class that I ever taught. Because what this story told them was that their spirituality, their identity as Aboriginals, as Christian Aboriginals, didn't depend on what? Land. But it depended on God's word and the divine service. It didn't discount the land because they could see how important the land was all the way through here. They could understand they could understand that when Abraham was told to leave his land, his kindred, his family, he was told to commit suicide, because any Aboriginal leaving their territory, their ancestors, becomes a nobody. They lose everything. They could see it, and I became aware just of the significance of that from the discussion that they had about God's command to Abraham to leave his land, his kindred, his family. They could understand that. And they could also understand the frustration that Abraham would have had and Isaac would have had. They were in the land had been promised to them, but they could never take possession of the land. They could use the benefits of the land, but they not yet, the land wasn't theirs. They lastly could understand very, very clearly the significance of Abraham owning only a cemetery. Because for Aboriginals, the place where you are buried is of immense significance. And they know that the land, in fact, doesn't belong to them. It belongs to who? Their ancestors, the spirits of their ancestors. So they become landowners only when they die.
Like modern Western people.
Yes. No, they don't. Modern Western people don't even become landowners when they die. Now, I want to look at two things next period: the call of Abraham and God's blessing of Abraham, and then God's covenant with Abraham. Secondly, I also want to schedule in a make-up period, as I hinted at. I can't do it